This episode is brought to you by Rad Dudes Who Love Nature.
Every creature deserves our conservation attention. I know, even the ugly ones. But when
these are not ugly.
Right, I know. This is like one of our most spectacular animals we've got as a country. Yeah, we can't let this one blink out. Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. On this episode, we're delighted to have Brian Halstead, PhD, a research biologist with the US Geological Survey, and we're going to be talking about San Francisco garter snakes. If you are from North America, anywhere from Mexico way up into Canada, or I guess even Central America way up into Canada, you might be familiar with garter snakes. It's a really common smallish snake that you see a lot around water, sometimes a little further away from water, a bunch of different species of them. We're going to get into that a little bit. By the way, there are garter snakes, or what we call garter snakes in other parts of the world, not related to the North American garter snakes. The ones in Southeast Asia, I think, are actually venomous, more related to cobras than they are to the garter snakes and water snakes of North America. Basically, they're all named after a men's garment that is no longer worn very much. Basically, before the invention of elastic socks, you would have this strap called a garter that you would put above your calf and then attach your socks to it. They used to be striped. And so these snakes resemble those now not much used garments. Anyhow, it's a great conversation about a mind-blowingly gorgeous and rare species that just by the luck of biogeography and human history has ended up with its range pretty much entirely occupied by the San Francisco area. It is part of our interest in conservation efforts taking place in urban places. So if you know of a species that is being conserved or a rare species that's occurring in a city and work being done to keep it from going extinct in those urban places or in that city, please let us know. We'd love to hear about it at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com, or you can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. Find us on Facebook. Please also don't be shy to support us on our Patreon under the Wildlife Observer Network. I don't think Tony or I ever expect this to become a real moneymaker or a way to earn our living, but a little bit of support does help pay for equipment and for hosting costs and things like that. We just really appreciate the vote of confidence that you show us when you chip in. Turning now to self-promotion, you can still get my book, Exploring Philly Nature, A Guide for All Four Seasons, and I've also launched a Substack newsletter about urban wildlife. So you can read more of my writing on urban wildlife at Where the Brown Snakes Roam on Substack. Please subscribe and get your weekly urban nature writing fix there. So without much further ado, here's our conversation about San Francisco garter snakes.
Okay, I'm Brian Halstead, and I'm a research wildlife biologist with the US Geological Survey's Western Ecological Research Center. I work in Northern California and Nevada, and I mostly study reptiles and amphibians and also bats. Mostly what we do is we study things that are of conservation concern and try to provide resource managers with information they can use to better conserve these often maligned species that I tend to study. So.
That's heroic work, sticking up for the maligned species. I love it. Bats and snakes and stuff. So it's funny. The listeners can't see this, but your Zoom backdrop is a gorgeous San Francisco garter snake. But for people who aren't looking at one right now and maybe never really heard of this before, set the stage a little bit. Like, what is a San Francisco garter snake? What does it look like? Where do they live? What do they eat? That kind of stuff.
All right. Well, yeah. And it's hard to start talking about San Francisco garter snakes without talking about their appearance first, because they are probably the most stunning serpent in North America. At least I think so.
I think a lot of people think so.
Yeah, probably. Yes, they have this like red coppery head, and then down their body they have these longitudinal stripes that are bluish, red, and black in color. And there are subspecies of the common garter snake that ranges from coast to coast that probably most listeners are familiar with. it just so happens that the garter snakes out here on the coast of California tend to be really, really brightly colored. And they eat mostly amphibians out here. So their favorite foods are probably frogs. So Sierra tree frogs and threatened California red-legged frogs. But they also can eat toxic newts. So the California newt and rough-skinned newt, that they can eat those despite the tetrodotoxin that those species have. So, and then what else? Their range is restricted to the San Francisco Peninsula. So mostly San Mateo County. There are no San Francisco garter snakes, as far as I'm aware, in the city of San Francisco, except maybe like at the zoo or something. The zoo, I'm not even sure if that's technically in San Francisco now that I think of it. But at any rate, and there are no historical records from within the city limits. That doesn't mean that they didn't historically occur there. It's just that by the time people thought to look for them, there were none there. So,
and I have a question about their coloration. And I've thought of this for years, that a lot of garter snakes, not just the and my pronunciation of the Latin name is always terrible, but is it sirtalis or sirtalis?
I would say sirtalis, but
all right, we'll go with sirtalis.
I don't really know either.
But when you're looking sirtalis, which is like the common garter snake, the one that's like basically coast to coast, and then even some other ones like the plains garter, which is, I'm forgetting its scientific name, but
radix, I think.
There you go. That a lot of them exhibit red coloration, particularly as you get to the west. And you've got a California red-sided garter snake, which has got a little bit more black in between the stripes, basically, but looks pretty similar to a San Francisco garter snake. But I've always wondered, is this some kind of warning coloration? It seems like a awfully bright color pattern for critters that, and if you're used to, like, if you're on the eastern side of the country, garter snakes are like hawk candy, like they're, they're always especially in the breeding season when they're not being too wary, you always see them getting picked off by red-tailed hawks or red-shouldered hawks. And I've always wondered, like, do we know, is there anything distasteful about them to avian predators or anything about that red coloration?
It's funny because almost every year at the Joint Meeting of Ichthyologists and Herpetologists, I run into Chris Feldman from the University of Nevada, Reno, who studies tetrodotoxin resistance in garter snakes. And we're always like, oh, we need to, like, you figure out whether these snakes are sequestering toxins or something, and they're actually toxic to predators. But it's incredibly difficult, as you might imagine, to get the permits to lethally sample an endangered species. So we haven't answered that question. He has found resistance in other species of garter snakes. So that might be an interesting model to use to see. But not all of them are brightly colored. And it's really interesting. What makes the story even a little bit more exciting, or more intriguing, I guess, for me, is that when you look at Thamnophis elegans, the terrestrial garter snake out here, if you get farther inland, like in the Sierra Nevada, they don't have any red on them at all. But along the coast, the subspecies is the coast garter snake, and they'll have red, black, and yellow stripes, much like a San Francisco garter snake. The head color is different, the stripe colors are a little bit different, but they have red stripes. So it's like, well, now is that mimicry then? And so there's like these questions layered upon questions. It's really kind of intriguing to me.
It's intriguing to me too. And you were referring to something that I'll just expand on really quick for people who aren't so familiar with it, is that you've got in garter snakes out west, where you have relatively toxic newts, you've almost got, everybody uses the term arms race, where like you've got, it seems that you have newts becoming more toxic, and then garter snakes apparently having evolved greater resistance to those toxins over time, and which can vary kind of locally too, like or on a scale that's smaller than you might think, given the range of the newts and the range of the garter snakes. But it's a neat topic. Yeah, it's something that does leap to mind when you see all these bright red colored garter snakes. So I guess if I could ask you a little bit about their habitat also. I mean, in the eastern United States, garter snake habitat is really easy to come by. It's just like anywhere you've got water, pretty much fresh water, pretty much, you've got garter snakes. If you're in a lake, a river, whatever else, if they can find fish and salamanders and frogs and maybe earthworms, like they can usually make a living. And so I guess are they inhabiting kind of the same species out west, just that out west there isn't as much of those spaces? Like where do they live? Where do you find? Well, always with this caveat, you can't tell us like details about where exactly you find an endangered species, of course. But like, what kind of terrain do you find them in?
Yeah, it's exactly what you described and what you'd expect for garter snakes. So, out here you have, garter snakes in or near most wetland areas. And in fact, as you get farther west, garter snakes kind of fill that ecological niche of the water snakes in the east. So we have really highly aquatic garter snakes out here too, like the narrow-headed garter snake and the giant garter snake, the two-striped garter snake, for example. But yeah, I find them, maybe the sirtalis out here, the common garter snake, tends to be maybe a little bit more tied to water than what my experience has been in the eastern U.S. And that might just be because when you're not by water, it tends to be drier out here, unless you're right on the coast. So, but yeah, so marshes and ponds, especially if they have upland grasslands or shrublands surrounding them and not necessarily dense forest, those tend to be the areas that we find San Francisco garter snakes within their range. So,
and I guess there are subspecies, so I might be answering my own question, but is there much difference between them? Obviously there's a meaningful difference at some level, but is there much difference between them and like the California red-sided garters that are more widespread and are the same species? Are they, in terms of habits and everything else, are they sort of just like a meaningful but relatively slight variation on the more widespread ones?
Yeah, that's a good way of characterizing it. I don't know, different people will argue about, the differentiation between San Francisco garter snakes and California red-sided garter snakes. But ecologically, I think they're pretty similar.
Okay.
I haven't done enough studies of red-sided garter snake or the California red-sided, because there's also another red-sided garter snake that to really differentiate the two of them.
Gosh. All right. Yeah. There's a I think is the California one Infernalis?
Yes.
That's just one of the best subspecies names you got out there. Like it's basically calling it the infernal garter snake, which I've always got a kick out of. You answered a question I had because I was looking at some of the documents. Whenever there's an endangered species, there's always an abundance of research, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service has documents which are great primers if you're trying to catch up on them. And just had a question about the range, just because it's sort of maybe it's because they're demarcating it by county, but it has that sort of stops right south of the city. I guess this maybe feel like a kind of this feels maybe like a little bit like another dumb question, but why are they endangered? So what is it? What got them on the list?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of reasons actually for these snakes. So the first and most obvious one, and probably the biggest reason, is just urbanization. Their habitat getting converted to other uses, urban, commercial, residential development, agriculture, things like that.
And it's not a big area to start with.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's a small area, and it's one of the most densely populated areas in the country. So you combine those two things, and you're at a huge disadvantage when it comes to persisting. And then the other thing is, as you might imagine, for a really pretty snake, was collection for the pet trade and for breeding. So that was another big one. And then the other thing is kind of loss of their prey. So it's kind of an interesting story.
That California red-legged frogs come to my mind right away. Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah. So California red-legged frogs are an important prey item for the species, for San Francisco garter snakes, and they're themselves a threatened species. And back during the gold rush and for a time period thereafter, they were popular as food for humans. So the California red-legged frog actually.
I just gave you a look. Like how big is it?
What's
it's not
that?
I think of like a bullfrog as having meaningful sized legs to eat.
Yeah. Well, they're the biggest frog out here.
Okay.
So that's the native frog out here. So that's probably why they were the target for frog legs. But then you actually kind of foreshadowed my next statement, which was, so when those frogs disappeared, they brought bullfrogs in, right? And so bullfrogs out here, they're a nice native species in the east, but in the western U.S., they're an invasive species, and they compete with San Francisco garter snakes for food. They can eat small garter snakes, and the garter snakes really don't, San Francisco garter snakes anyways, don't really eat many bullfrogs. So it's kind of a net negative interaction between the snakes and the bullfrogs. So you have those introduced competitors and predators as well. But those three things I'd say are the biggest one: habitat loss and fragmentation, collection pressure, and then loss of prey and introduced predators kind of go to get hand in hand.
Kind of getting it from all sides. I mean, and for those who aren't familiar with the size of these species, I mean, if they're like the eastern subspecies of garter snakes, these things, I mean, the females are probably bigger. They probably might top out at like 3 feet. And then like the males are smaller. And so a bullfrog, like pretty much that's a word I always trip over, changes into an adult at a size like almost too big for a garter snake to choke down. And so it's already, it's the bullfrog already has I mean, I think out here, I guess the snake predators of bullfrogs would mainly just be water snakes, which are bigger snakes than garter snakes. So it's easy to see how they can't quite, how they it's a one-sided predation relationship.
And they're mostly eating the smallest garter snakes, the neonates, the newborns, and maybe up to a year old. I don't think they're getting many adult snakes. But it's interesting because when you go to the Central Valley, giant garter snakes and even common garter snakes out there, the valley garter snake is the subspecies out there. They grow much larger than the San Francisco garter snakes, and there they do eat, not the biggest adult bullfrogs, but the recent metamorphs and the tadpoles. So it's interesting how the dynamics really are so size dependent between snakes and introduced bullfrogs. Yeah.
Neat. Well, sad and neat. It's a funny thing to think of. We're always, wherever you are locally, you're always dealing with someone else's species as challenging invasives, and then it's funny to think of one of your own species as being a mess somewhere else.
And it's really, troubling as a biologist when you travel to the eastern U.S. different from the western U.S. It's like, okay, I need to like the bullfrogs here, whereas I hate them, back home. So it's like you have to kind of flip that switch and be like, oh, they're great where they belong, but it's where they don't belong that we don't like them. So
God, if I travel to like, I don't know, now I'm imagining traveling to like East Asia and being okay with trees of heaven and Japanese maui and stuff like that, kudzu.
Right.
I guess, and just this is maybe kind of boring stuff to get through, but when did they end up on the endangered species list? Like when did people realize that we've got a real problem with these guys?
Right. So their listing actually, they were listed on the precursor to the endangered species list in 1967. I can't remember exactly when the Endangered Species Act was ratified, but it was after that. So they're on the
early 70s
list. Yeah. So they've been on the list longer than it existed technically. And so it's interesting when you go back to the recovery plan. They first started doing recovery plans, I think, in the 80s, and it's on typed out scanned copies that I've seen, and it's like, I can't imagine writing papers like that anymore.
I love reading those documents. I myself had a career as a federal administrator in a different agency, very different agency, but still, you'd pull those things out of the files and you'd be like, man, someone spent a lot of time typing this thing out. It was just not, you couldn't just click a button and print it back then.
Yeah.
So what can we, in my mind, I sort of have, it seems like a very static situation on the ground with the habitat. Like, I don't know I guess by that I mean you've got like the waterways that they'll occur in, and then in between, I imagine you don't have flexible land uses. You probably have housing and things like that where you can't just say like let's erase all these houses and somehow connect the habitat. You know what I mean? Like it's
right.
What do you do? So what do recovery efforts look like? like for an animal occurring in that kind of landscape?
Yeah, so there are areas where there's substantial open space left, kind of in the southern and western part of the range, sort of southwestern San Mateo County, where there is still some ranch land and stuff. And there are open space trusts and regional open space districts that work to preserve those lands. So that's kind of the first step, is preventing further loss and fragmentation. Then the next layer of that is preventing the further loss and protecting those areas, and then enhancing what's protected. So there's ways that they can manage wetlands, either to create more wetlands or ponds that are more productive for amphibians, especially the tree frogs and California red-legged frogs, which is great because that's also recovering the threatened California red-legged frog too. So you get kind of a 2-for-1 deal there. And then limiting invasive species. So we've worked with people that are trying to remove invasive fish and bullfrogs from small lakes and things.
Which isn't easy. I mean, you sort of
no.
Yeah, how do you get rid of bullfrogs?
Well, the site we were working at, they were going to drain this lake and then harvest all the bullfrogs. The adults can disperse and persist, and then just kind of really closely monitor the adults coming back. At this site, there was fortunately no other water bodies close by that had bullfrogs, so they were able to do it. And the drought in the 2012 to 2016 drought dried the lake on its own, so they actually were able to capitalize on that. Wow. So to my knowledge, I think they've been successful in keeping bullfrogs and fish from recolonizing that site. So that's been great. But it's really difficult where you have large networks of wetlands or streams, because you just have a constant source of new colonizers to get into those areas. So that removing invasive species is really, really difficult. And bullfrogs do tend to be a little bit less of a problem right along the coast. So that's kind of an area where we do have some hope for bullfrog-free habitat. And then, so I've mentioned stopping habitat loss, habitat enhancements. One of the things, so we recently worked with some geneticists at our center here in USGS to look at the population genetics of San Francisco garter snakes. And, they're, as you'd expect, remaining populations are pretty isolated. And for populations that we had samples for over time, they're becoming more distinct and losing genetic diversity. And so there's been a lot of talk about doing translocations or captive rearing to try to take care of a couple things. One is a lot of these populations are really small, less than 100 individuals total. So to augment those populations where we can, and when you're doing that, to pay attention to the genetic diversity and try to enhance genetic diversity as well. So, and then where there's open areas, go ahead, sorry.
So you could swap, you would breed them and then release the neonates, or you'd swap males around or something like that and see if they would stick around?
We're actually working on that plan right now. So my lab is working on the demographic plan. So which individuals can you take from a population and minimize the effects to that donor population?
Sure.
Because you don't want to, take snakes until they go extinct at your donor population either. And then which snakes do you put back into the new populations or the existing populations to be augmented to increase your chances of establishment? So we're working on that piece. And then our geneticist collaborators, Dustin Wood and Amy Vandergast, they're looking at what is the best strategy to kind of maintain the historical genetic structure, but also enhance the genetic health of these populations. So there's a lot of considerations. When it gets into the genetics, it just kind of makes my head spin.
Well, you just said that. It made me, before I was like, oh, yeah, just move them around. But then if you're concerned that there might be something historically distinctive about a particular population, you don't want to swamp that. Do people, I think of this discussion much more when people talk about plants. They get concerned about particular local, ecotypes of a particular plant species. So you can't necessarily take seeds of some goldenrod from Tennessee, or this is what is said, that you can't take seeds from some goldenrod in Tennessee and use them to revegetate habitat in Pennsylvania or something like that on a smaller scale? Are there concerns about that with would you consider because you think of with salmon, salmon might have a specific genetic profile for specific genetically defined population for a given river. Do you worry about that on the scale of a stream or a marsh for garter snakes?
It kind of depends upon the degree of isolation.
Okay.
How far is it? What's in between, and how long has that been there?
Yeah.
There's, like I said, it gets really complicated really fast. But there is and so you're exactly right. You don't want to genetically swamp a unique population or subpopulation. And with the garter snakes, it might not be quite this severe. But the classic example I can think of is Florida panthers, right?
Yep.
They were in real genetic trouble. They had a lot of deformities, a lot of trouble reproducing. And coincidentally, that's one of the first markers in the that you read about in the literature for snakes that are suffering from inbreeding, is that they have a lot of deformities and really reduced fecundity or birth rates. So that's a real big problem for snakes when they become genetically isolated and deteriorated.
Do you see that with the San Francisco garters?
We don't have enough information.
Okay.
We do have some information on litter sizes, but we don't really have any information about, are those newborns all healthy and recruiting well into the population well and stuff. And I think in the larger populations, it probably isn't a concern, but it might be a concern in some of the smaller and more isolated populations.
Okay.
The example of that from the literature is some adders on an island in Sweden, for example. They were really doing poorly, and then they introduced some males from another population, and they started doing much, much better by that infusion of new genes.
Yeah, and you were alluding to the panther or the mountain lion situation where they took some males from Texas or something like that. And
right, exactly. Yeah. And that was a huge controversy at the time. Then they're not going to be Florida panthers anymore, So I don't think we're to that level of controversy of the snakes. But at the extreme, it becomes: do we let something go extinct, or if by worrying so much about genetic purity of a lineage, or do we, save it and not have what we consider to be a pure version of it? And that's a question that that's for other people to make those to answer those questions.
Yeah, that's it is heavy stuff. It is, because it's also not like you're meddling with some pristine situation. You're trying to remedy a problem that we've very much created through human action.
And what I'm talking about here is definitely way more extreme than what we're dealing with the snakes. It's just that the point is that when you move things around for conservation, it needs to be very, very carefully thought out.
It does. And you haven't even mentioned pathogens and things like that you might move.
Right, exactly.
You might infect one population with something from another population. So Brian, the thought occurs to me. I decided to match Brian's background with snakes of my own on Zoom, and chose a pile of gestating timber rattlesnakes, but where you've got a pathogenic fungus that's been a point of controversy and concern in the snake world in general, but also especially the timber rattlesnake world. I guess I just thought that up. Does that show up out west? Are you guys seeing the fungus?
So we've done surveillance with giant garter snakes and San Francisco garter snakes for the fungus that causes snake fungal disease, and we haven't found it in either of those species.
Cool.
There was a positive detection of the fungus in, I believe it was a king snake in Northern California.
Oh.
And so there is continued surveillance for it. But to my knowledge, we haven't had it, at least not to the extent that you do in the eastern U.S. A lot like white nose syndrome with bats, or maybe it's marching out this way just like white nose syndrome did, and hopefully it doesn't have as drastic a consequences as that did for the bats.
Man, I sure hope so. So we've seen it out here where we used to little brown bats used to be one of the most abundant bat species in urban areas here, and now they're essentially gone. And a few years ago, I was in Kentucky, and this had to be 6 or 7 years ago, and white nose had just reached out there, And so it was sort of like we've been watching it kind of go across the continent. And then we also have the example of were the red-legged frogs affected by the chytrid fungus that's been hitting frogs, or is that not so much a problem there?
So that's a really good question.
While we're going through all the horrible fungal
exactly.
pathogens.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of populations that are persisting with the fungus. I mean, it's really hard to find places where the fungus that causes chytridiomycosis doesn't occur out here. I don't know if it might have contributed to past declines potentially, and certainly in the Sierra Nevada, it's decimated populations of mountain and Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frogs. So we know that for therianid frogs out here, it can have dramatic consequences. I think they've demonstrated it with Cascades frogs too. It can really decimate them. But the red-legged frogs tend to occupy a little warmer area that might be a little bit less suitable for the fungus. That's not to say that there weren't effects in the past, or that there's not, either reduced survival at the population level or other things that are going on where the fungus is affecting the frogs. But it's not as much of a concern for California red-legged frogs as it is for some of the other ranids out here.
Got it. Okay. Well, that's good at least. Yeah. Your comment about things happening in the past it's an important one that I wish people, we'll remind people that we haven't been studying critters like this carefully for all that long in the grand scheme of things. And I once wrote an article about this for a magazine here in Philadelphia about in Pennsylvania, we've got a few frog species that seem to have gone through declines in the mid-20th century, and no one knows why. And you got ideas, but it wasn't studied, and so we just don't know. We have things like chorus frogs and cricket frogs and northern leopard frogs, spadefoot toads. It's a variety of frog species in Pennsylvania that might be actually kind of common in New Jersey, just across the river. But for whatever reason, 60 years ago, 70 or 80 years ago, they went into decline, but no one was studying them carefully, and we just can't say what happened. Well, maybe
museum records are. Oh, I should say museum collections are really helpful there, because I know that some groups out here have tried to reconstruct the arrival of the chytrid fungus in California, and there's some evidence, for foothill yellow-legged frogs, that that they may have caused past declines, and the timing is kind of coincident with when they detect BD in museum specimens. A BD is short for Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, which is the.
Why would you shorten that word?
Yeah. I have no idea.
Well, in any case, so what does the future look like for the San Francisco garter? What are the goals in conservation recovery at this point?
Yeah, so I can't remember off the top of my head. I think the recovery plan calls for 10 populations of 200 or more snakes at a 50-50 sex ratio. That's when they write these recovery plans, they have to have criteria. That might be really difficult to achieve, but I don't know. I think full recovery is going to be really difficult to achieve. I think persistence is possible. And I think just the knowledge of kind of the genetic plight of the snakes, the amount of attention that it garners, and there's a ton of talented people out here working on conserving these snakes, whether it's resource managers at federal, state, and local agencies. The zoos are involved. There's just consultants. There's a lot of people that are really concerned about these snakes and trying to make sure that they don't blink out on our watch. So so I'm optimistic about persistence, but about recovery and delisting, I think that's a little bit steeper hill to climb.
Okay. Well, I hope someday to see one. It might have to be we'll see. I don't get out west all that often, but it's a goal. And it's just every creature deserves our conservation attention. I know, even the ugly ones. But when,
these are not ugly.
Right, I know. This is one of our most spectacular animals we've got as a country. We can't let this one blink out. So I appreciate all the work you're doing, and thank you very much for coming on to talk to us about it.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to share, and I really appreciate it.
Hey folks, again, thanks for listening. And if you have ideas of species where conservation work for them is being done in cities, again, this can be that their range happens to be where human cities have grown up, or maybe this is a species that has a wider range, but in a particular country or a particular locality that it only happens to occur where there is a city, and thus conservation occurs there. Or even species that aren't particularly rare, but people living in the city don't want to see them go away and work to protect them. We'd love to hear more about these kind of examples and get them on the podcast. Thanks.